1916, Vizcaya was built to look like imported Europe on American soil. But one internal route, recorded in early descriptions, doesn't cleanly exist on today's public map, as if someone decided it shouldn't be found. This video examines Vizcaya, the mansion on Biscayne Bay, and how it was engineered in Miami in 1916 to project European prestige as a form of American status. The verdict is simple. Vizcaya was not merely inspired by Europe. It was designed to perform Europe on purpose for an EU audience that mattered. And the first sign that this performance required quiet management is concrete. When you compare a modern visitor route with an older description of service circulation, one internal connection, the kind that moves staff, supplies, and decisions, seems to fade into vague language and closed thresholds. The question is not whether the building changed. The question is why a traceable route would be treated as if it belongs to maintenance rather than memory. And this film will prove how and why that happened. To understand the stakes, you have to place Vizcaya inside its moment. In 1916, the United States was watching Europe tear itself apart in World War I, while its own industrial fortunes grew and its social hierarchy hardened. By April 1917, America would enter the war, and public attention would shift toward patriotism, scrutiny, and reputational risk. In that environment, the elite did not only build houses, they built narratives, structures meant to outlast headlines, protect inheritances, and survive the judgment of society pages. A mansion could be a personal residence and a public argument at the same time. Proof of taste, proof of legitimacy, proof that wealth had been translated into civilization. James Deering's Vizcaya sits directly in that tension. The grand rooms and curated vistas were meant to be seen, photographed, described, repeated. But every mansion has a second architecture, the one that makes the spectacle possible. Corridors, without ornament, stairwells without portraits, doors that exist for function, not admiration. When those routes are clearly referenced in early operational language, yet later treated as unmentionable or inaccessible, you're no longer studying decor. You're studying governance, what a legacy chooses to display, and what it chooses to classify as merely technical. Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? Because that is the quiet problem at the center of Vizcaya. Not a rumor, not a metaphor. An inconsistency between what the estate must have needed to operate in 1916 and what the official experience is willing to acknowledge today. And it begins with a simple act, a map on one side, an older reference on the other, and a line that should connect them, but doesn't. And that is where the record begins. The first surviving trace appears in 1917, less than a year after Vizcaya's completion, in a maintenance ledger bound in gray linen and labeled simply, House Operations. Among the ordinary entries for plumbing repairs and imported fixtures, one line diverges from the predictable rhythm of domestic upkeep. It lists the installation of a lock, brass, double cylinder, imported from New Haven, with the notation, Restricted, East Service Stair. The handwriting is deliberate, administrative rather than architectural, and the word restricted is underlined once. No other space in the ledger carries that classification. The record, filed among invoices for paint and tile, should not have drawn attention, yet its phrasing breaks pattern. In estates of this era, doors were private, staff, or secured. Restricted belongs to the vocabulary of access control, not household management. The entry's date, March 14, 1917, places it between the final shipments of European furnishings and the last visit of James Deering before the United States entered the war. That moment mattered. Imports were halting, Miami's port was under inspection, and wealthy owners were adjusting their household operations under tightening scrutiny. Deering's estate manager, identified elsewhere as Charles McGonigal, had begun converting verbal orders into typed directives, suggesting the property was shifting from private construction to institutionalized maintenance. The fact that this specific installation received a special mark, restricted, implies an instruction that exceeded routine repair. When the ledger resurfaced in 1973 during a cataloging project, archivists logged it as technical material, non-public circulation. The folder's cover still carries that annotation. What makes the record peculiar is not the existence of the door, but its disappearance from every later plan. Cross-referencing the 1917 ledger with a 1920 floor diagram, one prepared for insurance purposes, reveals an erasure. The east service stair is present in the early schematic, linking the kitchen corridor to an intermediate landing near the gallery. In the later drawing, the stairwell terminates abruptly against a solid wall. No revision note, no construction permit, no demolition order explains the change. The action that defines this moment is clerical, the reclassification of a living space into administrative language. A door once identified by location and function becomes an item of control, restricted, and then, within 3 years, it vanishes from the official map. The consequence is reputational rather than structural. By removing the stairing from the public narrative, Vizcaya's caretakers purified the geometry of the house. Visitors see symmetry, records reveal omission. That kind of disappearance protects the illusion of effortless grandeur. No visible labor, no trace of logistics, no reminder that elegance depends on someone unseen behind a door that now exists only in handwriting. When archivists encountered the ledger decades later, they left a faint pencil mark beside the word restricted, perhaps recognizing its dissonance, but choosing not to pursue it. In museums and estates alike, there is an etiquette to curiosity. Some questions are acknowledged only in marginalia. Have you ever noticed how institutional silence leaves fingerprints in pencil? The page ends with an unnumbered entry. Replace key, same status. It offers no room, no justification, just a continuity of classification. That single phrase turns the document from household record into historical signal. It confirms that whatever the door secured in 1917 was meant to remain controlled, even after the function had supposedly disappeared. The stair itself might have been walled, the corridor repurposed, but the administrative idea, restricted, survived on paper. And it is on that page, creased at the fold, that the first real evidence of omission begins to take shape. A door once opened daily now exists only as ink and absence, the kind of proof that requires nothing more than one word, underlined once, to disturb an entire narrative. To understand why a single operational note in 1917 could matter, you have to remember what Vizcaya was trying to do in 1916 and what the country was becoming by 1917-1919. The house was built as a public argument that an American industrial fortune could be translated into European legitimacy without needing centuries of ancestry to support it. James Deering did not commission Vizcaya in a vacuum. He commissioned it at the edge of a city that was still trying to convince the nation it belonged. On the same cultural map as Newport, Fifth Avenue, or the Riviera, Miami was selling itself as a destination. The northern elite was testing whether that sales pitch could be trusted, and houses like this were the proof points people carried back home as stories. In that environment, the boundary between private residence and public instrument was thin. The grand rooms were not simply for living, they were for being seen. Society papers and society columns were part of the architecture. A name placed correctly in print could cement a reputation. A name placed badly could haunt it for years. By 1916, the social machinery that had defined the late Gilded Age had not vanished. It had adapted. Industrial wealth still required cultural cover. Taste was still a credential, and a mansion that openly performed European refinement could elevate the owner, the guests, and the city itself. That is why the language of control matters. When a door is labeled restricted in March 1917, it is not simply about keeping visitors out of a utility space. It signals that a boundary had become sensitive enough to require formal classification. The action is administrative. A routine element of circulation is redefined as a controlled point. In elite houses, administrative language is rarely neutral. It is often the cleanest way to protect the messy parts of a narrative without admitting they exist. The ledger entry reads like a small thing, but in context it sits inside a period where small Things were being managed with new caution. The timeline tightens for reasons that had nothing to do with architecture. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I, and the atmosphere around wealth, travel, and foreign ties sharpened. Imports slowed. Ports were monitored. Public attention shifted toward loyalty, propriety, and visible contribution. A property built around imported European objects and European design cues was not automatically suspicious, but it did exist in a moment. When public optics could turn quickly, and when elites were quietly adjusting what they displayed and what they kept behind doors. Even in the best circles, there were questions people avoided in public and resolved in private. How much foreign luxury could you showcase in a wartime climate? How did you present an estate as a cultural achievement without inviting scrutiny into the machinery that made it run? The answer often was to tighten the boundaries and refine the story. In those years, a household like Deering's was a small institution. It was staffed, scheduled, supplied, and managed. It had keys, inventories, access rules, and personnel decisions. And because it was a symbol, those internal systems were not merely practical, they were reputational. Staff movements were not just labor, they were visibility. Who could be seen where, and by whom, became part of the control of perception. In the world of northern industrial elites wintering in Florida, the wrong person seen in the wrong place could become gossip before it became fact. Domestic arrangements could invite speculation. Health could become rumor. Money could become commentary. Inheritance could become an anxious topic if an estate looked less stable than it claimed. This is why a service route is not merely a service route. In a mansion designed to impress, the backstage must remain backstage. Not because it is shameful in itself, but because it breaks the spell. Vizcaya's public spaces were meant to be read as inevitable, like the product of history rather than the product of design and purchase. The moment the public is reminded of the work, the discipline, the staffing, and the control behind the performance, the illusion changes. It becomes modern again. It becomes an operation, and operations invite questions that taste alone cannot answer. From 1916 to 1919, the press environment reinforced that pressure. Even when a house was not explicitly covered as news, it was present as social signal. The elite did not need headlines to feel exposed. They only needed the steady circulation of names, invitations, and impressions. Society coverage functioned as a ledger of belonging. A property like Vizcaya could elevate the host, but it could also expose the host to interpretation, especially when the host was an industrial magnate whose wealth was recent enough to be discussed in public terms. Europeanization was a strategy, but strategies have vulnerabilities. Anything that contradicted the curated story, anything that suggested friction, dependence, or internal irregularity, could become the kind of detail people repeated because it felt like the real story. So control becomes an inheritance issue as well as an image issue. Once a house is positioned as a legacy object, its narrative begins to carry financial weight. The more Vizcaya was framed as an enduring cultural landmark, an estate with a coherent identity, the more disruptive any internal contradiction could become. Contradiction does not have to be scandalous to be costly. It only needs to be embarrassing to the wrong audience at the wrong time. It can complicate relationships with patrons, trustees, and institutions. It can create friction in how a property is valued, preserved, or eventually administered. The consequence of exposure is not only social, it can become institutional, because institutions depend on stable stories the public can accept without suspicion. That is why the vocabulary of restricted reads differently once you understand the era. It is a word that converts a space into a controlled liability. It is the kind of word you use when you do not want a question to form at the door. And by 1917-1919, questions formed easily. The nation was changing. Miami was branding itself. Northern elites were measuring whether Florida could host their social life without diminishing it. And Deering's Vizcaya, perched at the water, was both a personal project and a public test. What survives in the record is never the whole story, but it does preserve the shape of a decision-making environment. In those years, the safest way to keep a narrative intact was to reduce the number of people who could contradict it. That meant restricting paths, controlling keys, standardizing descriptions, moving from informal knowledge, everyone knows that door is for staff, to formal classification. Restricted. The action is simple. The consequence is durable. Once something is formally restricted, it becomes easier to treat it as non-existent in public materials, because the institution can always claim it falls outside the visitor experience. And this is where the ledger's afterlife matters. When that 1917 notation was later filed as technical non-public circulation, it followed the same logic, just under different institutional clothing. The vocabulary changes from household management to preservation policy, but the effect is familiar. The most operational records are the easiest to keep out of sight because they are framed as irrelevant to history. Yet operational records are often where reputational choices hide. They are the places where control is written without fanfare. By the end of 1919, Vizcaya could function as intended, a seamless stage of European prestige, with the machinery of labor and movement pushed behind a surface the public could admire without complication. The estate did not need a conspiracy to achieve that. It needed discipline, classification, and an awareness of what the era could punish. The question is not whether such discipline existed. It did, because the ledger proves someone cared enough to label a door. The question is when that concern turned from routine management into deliberate posture. The page from March 14, 1917 ends in the same quiet tone it begins, but the underlined word remains. Restricted. One line in a maintenance ledger, and a key that had to be replaced, same status. It is not a revelation on its own. It is a pressure point, and pressure points are where institutions eventually decide whether to explain, to reclassify, or to erase. By 1918, Vizcaya had already shifted from a building project into something more delicate, a working estate that also functioned as a public statement. The maintenance ledger from March 14, 1917 did not create that reality. It only captured it in the plainest form possible. One underlined word that turned a door into a controlled point. What changed in 1918 was not the existence of the route, but the posture around it. That year, with wartime scrutiny hardening and household operations becoming more formal, the estate stopped treating access as a practical matter and began treating it as a narrative risk that needed a policy. The paper trail is thin, which is exactly what makes the surviving pieces valuable. A typed memorandum dated October 3, 1918, filed not with architectural plans but with operating correspondence, shows the first moment the vocabulary becomes standardized. It is addressed to the estate's household supervisors and signed by Charles McGonigal, the estate manager whose name appears in later internal records. The memo does not accuse anyone of wrongdoing, and it does not dramatize the issue. It reads like a man trying to prevent a small operational detail from turning into a recurring question. He references service circulation only once, then replaces it with a safer term, utility access. The difference is not stylistic, it is administrative. Service implies people. Utility implies systems. People create stories. Systems create silence. The memo's core instruction is simple and explicit. Effective immediately, several internal passages, including the East Service stair noted in 1917, are to be treated as restricted utility access, and any description used outside staff communications must refer to them only as maintenance areas. That is the concrete action, a reclassification order converting a functional route into a category designed to end conversation. It is not an architectural revision, at least not yet. It is a linguistic intervention meant to control how the estate is explained to anyone who does not need to know how it truly operates. McGonigal's phrasing suggests the trigger was not a single incident, but a pattern. He notes that questions have been raised by visitors and by outside parties during routine movement through the house. He never names those parties, which fits the etiquette of elite administration. You do not commit names to paper when the goal is to stop a subject from forming, but the implication is clear. The estate had reached a point where staff circulation and public circulation were colliding in ways that threatened the performance Vizcaya was built to deliver. If the mansion's success depended on the illusion of effortless European grandeur, then visible logistics, keys, corridors, backstairs, thresholds were a kind of contamination. Not morally, narratively. A second document tightens the picture. In January 1919, a short note appears in the key log, one of those operational records that rarely survive because they are treated as disposable. It records a change in custody. Keys to the East utility access are moved from a general ring used by multiple supervisors to a limited set held by a single office. There is no flourish, no explanation, only a signature and a date. But custody is policy in physical form. When keys move, authority moves with them. The action here is concrete, access is centralized, and what used to be part of ordinary household flow becomes an administratively guarded point. It is possible to dismiss that as ordinary security, but the timing makes it harder to ignore. In 1919, the estate is not merely protecting valuables, it is protecting coherence. Vizcaya is young enough that its story is still being set. The moment a story is still being set is the moment institutions become most careful with language, because language becomes precedent. A door described as service in one year becomes a topic in the next. A stair mentioned casually becomes a location people ask to see. And once the question exists, it does not stay confined to the building. It travels into letters, into social conversation, into the kind of small commentary that can grow teeth in a society that feeds on implication. The memo's most revealing element is not what it restricts, but what it instructs staff to do when asked. McGonagall does not authorize improvisation. He gives a script. If a visitor inquires about a closed passage or a missing connection, staff are to respond that it is maintenance only and not part of the house experience. That is not simply customer service. It is the conversion of an architectural fact into an institutional boundary. The estate is deciding what counts as history and what counts as function. And once that decision is made, it becomes easier to enforce later. Through paperwork, diagrams, and official descriptions, because the logic is already on file. The authority behind the decision is implied rather than declared, but the hierarchy is visible. McGonagall signs, but he writes in a tone that suggests authorization from above. The file's routing stamp, faint, partially smudged, includes the initials JD on the corner, a standard shorthand that would have required no explanation inside the office. Whether those initials represent James Deering's direct review or a proxy acknowledgement, their presence indicates the matter rose beyond housekeeping preference. That is the consequence that matters at this stage. The boundary became important enough to enter the estate's chain of command. Nothing in the memorandum claims that a scandal is imminent. It does not need to. Elite administration rarely speaks in the language of fear. It speaks in the language of control, efficiency, and appropriateness. The logic is always the same. Certain elements are not for public view, not because they are dangerous in themselves, but because they undermine the intended reading of the property. Vizcaya was designed to be read as culture, collected, composed, inevitable. A visible staff route is a reminder that the house is also a workplace, a machine, a managed environment. For an owner importing prestige, that reminder changes the tone of everything the visitor sees. The deeper consequence is institutional. Once a policy defines an area as maintenance, it creates a legal and administrative shelter. Maintenance areas can be excluded from tours. They can be omitted from visitor diagrams without admitting omission. They can be left out of simplified plans under the pretext of safety, preservation, or operational necessity. And that is precisely what a policy is for. It allows the institution to make future changes without ever needing to justify them as narrative decisions. The decision is already recorded as technical prudence. There is one more detail, small but telling, in the October 1918 memo. McGonagall includes a line instructing that references in printed materials must avoid naming service circulation routes. The phrase is careful. as if drafted by someone who understood how documents become artifacts. Printed materials could mean internal handouts, informal guides prepared for guests, or early descriptions circulated among visitors. Whatever it refers to, it reveals the intent. This was not only about locking doors. It was about controlling language beyond the staff corridor. That is what makes the meeting behind the memo plausible, even if no minutes survive. You can hear the conversation in the instruction. Someone said, in effect, "We are not going to let this become a subject." So the decision is not a dramatic turning point. It is a bureaucratic one, which is often how long-term silences begin. In 1917, the ledger records a restricted point. In 1918 to 1919, the estate decides how that point will be described, who will hold the keys, and how staff will respond when the boundary is noticed. It formalizes a rule. What is backstage will be treated as technical, and what is technical will not be treated as history. That policy does not erase anything by itself. It creates the conditions under which erasure becomes orderly. And the documents end the way institutional decisions often end, with a short mark that closes the matter without explaining it. On the bottom right corner of the E. October 3, 1918. Memorandum, there is a clerk's notation, 2 words and a date, signaling the instruction has been circulated and filed. The ink is darker than the signature. It reads, filed 10/7/18. The paper is mundane, the directive restrained, but the implication is lasting. Because once a boundary is filed as policy, the next step is always easier to execute. A plan can be redrawn, a label can be changed, a line can quietly stop connecting. The decision is on record. Now, the record can be edited. By the time the estate's internal posture hardened in late 1918 and early 1919, the next step was almost inevitable. Policy creates vocabulary, and vocabulary reshapes documents. What follows in 1920 is not a dramatic demolition or a visible renovation. It is quieter and more durable. The moment paper begins to rewrite the house in a way that makes certain questions harder to ask. The alteration appears first in the kind of record that is meant to look neutral, an operational diagram, prepared for practical use. The sort of thing no one thinks of as storytelling until decades later, when you compare versions and realize the story has been managed. The key document is dated June 2, 1920, a simplified circulation plan produced for internal reference during seasonal staffing changes. It is not ornate. It is not an architect's showpiece. It is a plain utilitarian drawing with block labels and arrows indicating routes between kitchen, service corridors, and principal rooms. The plan is stamped with a filing mark and a short designation, House Utilities. The stamp matters because it aligns with the language introduced in 1918. The plan does not call itself a service plan. It does not call itself a staff plan. It calls itself Utilities, as if people were no longer part of the diagram's purpose. When you place that 1920 plan beside a surviving 1917-1918 schematic, the alteration becomes visible in the simplest way. A line that once connected now stops. In the earlier version, the east service stair is drawn as a continuous vertical route from the kitchen corridor up to an intermediate landing near the gallery level. It has no decorative designation, only the functional truth that it exists. In the 1920 plan, the stair is not drawn as a stair at all. The symbol is replaced by a blank rectangle, and the label is changed to storage. There is no legend explaining why. There is no revision note acknowledging that anything has been removed. The diagram does not declare a wall was built or a passage was sealed. It simply presents a new reality, a dead end where a route used to be. The action here is concrete and traceable. The route is reclassified on paper and made non-navigable in the document that staff would consult. A stair becomes storage. A corridor becomes utility. A door becomes an unmarked boundary. This is not the same as physically bricking something up, though that may have happened later. This is the administrative alteration that makes physical changes easier to execute without explanation. because the official internal reference has already been adjusted. A second layer of alteration appears in an inventory update prepared at the end of that same year. The inventory is dated November 18, 1920, and filed under supplies and fixtures, not architecture. It lists locks, hinges, and replacement hardware in plain terms, with locations reduced to generic categories. Where the 1917 ledger used East Service Stair, this inventory uses a new phrasing, East Utility Access. It is the same location, translated into the safer vocabulary, and then even that is softened. On the next line, the same zone is described as maintenance area, no visitor use. The specificity has been drained out of the record. A place becomes a category becomes a boundary. The language is doing the work. One detail in the 1920 plan suggests this was not a casual drafting decision. In the lower corner, there is a notation, reading per office instruction, followed by initials that match the estate manager's hand used in earlier routing marks. It does not name James Deering directly. It does not need to. At this stage, authority in elite administration is rarely spelled out. It is implied through filing systems and the quiet consistency of procedure. The plan was not created to deceive historians. It was created to manage operations while keeping certain operational realities from becoming conversational. In doing that, it also made the estate easier to narrate as a seamless cultural artifact. The consequence is both practical and reputational. Practically, a staff member relying on the 1920 plan would not be guided through the older route as a normal connection. Reputationally, the plan supports a future in which that connection can be described as if it never mattered. If a visitor's guide or an official description later omits the route, administrators can claim the omission is natural, because the house as documented does not foreground it. That is how an alteration on paper becomes a tool of institutional confidence. It gives the estate permission to speak in absolutes without appearing to lie. It is not lying. It is referencing its own curated records. This is where elite properties become uniquely difficult to read. The architecture can remain physically intact while its meaning is edited. A corridor does not need to be demolished to disappear from history. It only needs to be renamed and relocated into a category that the public is trained to ignore. Storage does that. Utility does that. Maintenance does that. These words are not false. They are strategically insufficient. They do not tell you what the space was for, who used it, how often, or why it required restrictions in the first place. They end the conversation by sounding final. Would you have opened this file or left it sealed? Because once you accept the 1920 plan as merely technical, you accept the new map as the true house. You accept a dead end where a route once existed. You accept that storage is an explanation rather than a classification. And that acceptance is the method. It is the silent trade that preservation institutions often inherit from private estates. Protect the surface narrative and treat the operational record as irrelevant unless someone insists on reading it closely. By early 1921, the altered vocabulary appears again in a short internal guide prepared for seasonal staff. It instructs that utility areas are not to be discussed with guests, and it uses the same phrase that appeared in the 1918 memo, not part of the house experience. The policy has migrated into training. The training migrates into habit, and habit becomes the strongest form of continuity. The alteration, then, is not a single stroke. It is a sequence. A line removed from a plan, a stair relabeled, an access point reduced to maintenance, and a paper reality that makes the physical house easier to present as unbroken. Vizcaya remains what it was built to be in 1916, an imported performance of Europe. But by 1920, the backstage is no longer simply backstage. It has been administratively redesigned to be unnameable. The 1920 plan ends with a clean border and a clean stamp, as if nothing complicated had occurred. Yet the absence it contains is specific. A connection that should be drawn is not drawn. A route that should be legible is made into storage, and the alteration sits there in ink. quiet, and procedural, preparing the next phase of the investigation with a single stubborn fact. A door that once required a restricted lock now leads, on paper, to nowhere. By 1925, the altered paperwork had done something that physical walls alone could never accomplish. It had created a cleaner version of Vizcaya, one that could be repeated without friction. When the East Service Stair became storage on a 1920 circulation plan and its access was reduced to maintenance only in internal language, that change did not just protect a corridor, it protected an image. And once an image is protected, you can track who benefits by watching what begins to appear in public descriptions and what quietly stops appearing at all. The first beneficiary is the most obvious, even if institutions rarely state it plainly. James Deering and the social ecosystem that treated Vizcaya as evidence of refinement rather than merely evidence of money. By the mid-1920s, Deering's name had become inseparable from the estate's meaning. The mansion was no longer a construction project, it was a legacy object. A legacy object lives and dies by coherence. If Vizcaya could be narrated as a seamless importation of European taste, architecture, gardens, art, etiquette, then Deering's wealth was converted into cultural authority. But the conversion required a controlled reading. The backstage could not compete with the front stage, because the moment the public begins to imagine the estate as an operation, the story shifts from culture to logistics. And logistics, in elite environments, invites questions about labor, dependency, and the mechanics of status. The altered records did not erase labor. They made it harder for labor to be discussed in the same breath as prestige. The second beneficiary is less romantic, but more durable. The estate's administrative apparatus, and by extension, any representative structure that would later manage the property as it moved toward institutional life. Even before formal museum identity hardened, the 1920-1921 language created a template that future managers could inherit. Utility, maintenance, storage. These are words that function like legal shelter. They allow administrators to restrict areas, omit them from simplified maps, and decline explanations without appearing evasive. The action that benefited them is not a single physical ceiling. It is the bureaucratic reclassification that made the estate easier to manage as a public-facing site. When you can say, "not part of the house experience," you can end the inquiry while sounding responsible. That is a managerial advantage, and by 1925, it is already visible in the estate's surviving communications. The third beneficiary is the narrative itself, what eventually becomes the brand of Vizcaya. In 1925, Miami is no longer only a developing coastal city. It is a place increasingly defined by aspiration, development, and a growing national audience. Vizcaya's value to that environment is symbolic. It offers the city an instant pedigree, a curated European presence that can be pointed to as proof that Miami has depth, culture, permanence. That symbolic value depends on selective visibility. Gardens, salons, imported pieces, and compositional vistas become the public-facing substance. Circulation systems, staff routes, service thresholds, anything that breaks the spell becomes administrative residue. You can see the pivot in how descriptions begin to prioritize surfaces. Public-facing language, even in informal releases and social mentions, gravitates toward what photographs well and what flatters the viewer. Grand rooms, formal gardens, a romance of Europe on the bay. Meanwhile, the operational vocabulary is pushed into file cabinets and labeled technical. The practical mapping of this benefit appears in a small but telling pattern in the documents that survive from the mid-1920s. The number of specific location names decreases while the number of functional categories increases. An earlier record might name a stair or a corridor. A later record will call the same zone East Utility. This is not just administrative tidiness, it is narrative compression. When places lose names, they lose story. When they become categories, they become harder to trace across time. That is an advantage for anyone tasked with maintaining a stable public narrative. because stability is easier when fewer specifics can be contradicted. There is also a subtler beneficiary, the northern elite circle that used Vizcaya as a seasonal statement. For them, the estate's prestige is social currency. The more the property reads as unbroken refinement, the more it flatters those who associate with it. If a visitor's experience remains focused on salons and gardens, the guests can participate in the performance without confronting the scaffolding behind it. That protects not only the owner's reputation, but the reputations of those who appear beside him. In elite ecosystems, association is a form of risk management. Anything that complicates the association, anything that suggests the performance requires heavy control, introduces a kind of social discomfort the wealthy prefer to avoid in public settings. The action that makes this measurable is editorial. Between 1920 and 1925, materials that circulate outward, whether intended for guests, press, or civic boosters, become more polished and less operationally curious. The house becomes a sequence of admired spaces. The estate becomes a composition. The backstage is not denied. It is simply excluded from the story as if it never belonged there. In practice, that means a visitor can walk through Vizcaya and feel the house is complete, while the administrative record knows that completeness is curated. The consequence is that the European prestige remains intact precisely because its supporting systems are treated as footnotes rather than as part of the main narrative. This is how the beneficiaries of silence are often identified. They are not always the people who ordered the change. They are the people whose interests are protected by the result. Deering's cultural legitimacy is protected. The estate's management gains a durable method to control inquiry. The city's aspirational image gains a reliable landmark. The social circle gains a stage that does not expose its rigging. And the institution to be gains a vocabulary that will later justify omissions as preservation, rather than as choice. By 1925, the silencing is no longer a single act. It has become a structure of advantage, and it leaves a trace that is almost too ordinary to notice. A short line in a later file inventory where the same area is referenced not as a place, but as a category, maintenance area, east, followed by a check mark, as if that were all anyone needed to know. The ink is neat, the language is final, and the question remains, suspended behind it. Who decided that a real part of the house should survive only as a checkbox? In 1931, Vizcaya's paper trail enters a different kind of danger, one that has nothing to do with society gossip and everything to do with survival. The Great Depression forced estates and institutions across the country into reorganizations, cost-cutting, and archival triage. What was once maintained for continuity became something to be streamlined. And when records are streamlined, what disappears is rarely random. It tends to be the material that creates questions, the material that requires explanation, the material that does not fit the story an institution can afford to tell when resources are scarce and scrutiny is high. The first sign of disappearance appears in a catalog comparison. A small internal index compiled in 1926, a typed house keys and access register, still preserves a granular numbering system. It lists key rings by category and assigns sequential identifiers to controlled access points. In that register, the East utility or access appears as a distinct line item with a key number that sits cleanly in sequence. 5 years later, in April 1931, a revised key log is created as part of an administrative consolidation. The newer log is shorter, less specific, and it carries a new heading: Essential Access Operations. In that 1931 version, the numbering jumps. The sequence advances normally until it reaches the range where the East access should appear, and then it skips ahead by 2 identifiers, as if those keys were never issued. There's no note stating they were retired, no mention of replacement, no annotation that the locks were removed, just a clean gap. The action here is simple and decisive. The record is rewritten without those entries. The consequence is immediate for anyone trying to trace continuity. A missing number does not prove a physical change, but it breaks the chain of custody. It makes it harder to argue that the access point remained significant. because significance is often proven through repetition. A second disappearance emerges from imagery. In 1932, a curator-associated album, assembled as a visual reference set for the estate's most presentable spaces, circulates internally as a selected views portfolio. It is not public-facing in the modern sense, but it is curated. When that album is compared to an earlier set of photographs from 1919 stored in an operations folder, one image is missing in a way that is too precise to ignore. The 1919 set includes a sequence: a kitchen corridor, a service landing, and then a view down a narrow passage that terminates in a door. The door is not romantic. It is practical, unadorned hardware, a threshold that looks used. In the 1932 album, the sequence is shortened. The corridor appears, the landing appears, the third image is absent, and the album jumps to a grand interior, as if the passage never belonged in the sequence at all. The removal is editorial, not accidental. The album was assembled by selection. Someone chose what a reference set should contain, and that choice has an operational effect. It normalizes the idea that certain spaces are not part of the estate's visual memory. This is how disappearance works in institutional records. It rarely announces itself with dramatic language. It arrives as a gap in sequence, a shortened set, a renaming that makes an older term impossible to search for. In 1931-1932, the estate's language is already prepared for this. Service has been softened into utility. Utility has been softened into maintenance. Now maintenance becomes something that does not require detailed retention. And once you accept that logic, you can discard specific references without feeling you are discarding history. You can tell yourself you are discarding technical clutter. The most consequential disappearance is textual. A small typed memo from December 1931, filed in administrative correspondence, references removal of outdated materials from house utilities files. It reads like routine housekeeping. It likely was, but it contains a phrase that reveals intent without confessing it. Retain only items necessary for current operations. That is the action in plain terms: culling. When an archive retains only what is necessary for operations, it loses precisely the material that would allow a later investigator to understand why a classification existed in the first place. Operations do not need historical explanations. Operations need functional instructions. That shift is devastating for continuity. It turns a layered record into a shallow one. In that same period, the naming of spaces changes again. A room designation that appears in earlier internal references as East Service Stair Landing is reduced in later documentation to a generic East Storage. The change is not merely semantic. It makes cross-referencing harder because the old label no longer maps cleanly to the new one. If you are searching for service stair, you will find nothing. If you are searching for restricted, you will find fewer entries. And if you are searching by key number, the sequence has been broken. Disappearance, in other words, becomes a technical phenomenon. It is achieved through documentation systems rather than through demolition. The consequence is that the investigation loses its thread at the exact point where it would most need it. In earlier years, the chain is readable. Restricted lock in 1917, standardized language in 1918, reclassified plan in 1920. By 1931 to 1932, the chain is interrupted. You no longer have the comforting repetition of a label across time. You have a gap, and gaps create plausible deniability. An institution can always claim missing items were routine losses, the natural casualty of reorganization, the inevitable result of the Depression's pressures. That claim may even be partially true, but it also functions as a shield. A missing document does not raise the same questions as a present one. A missing photo does not need interpretation, it simply isn't there. And the disappearing is not limited to paper. In the revised 1931 log, there is an even smaller detail, a line where a clerk has written "consolidated" beside a category and then struck through a subordinate label. The ink is thin, but the act is unmistakable. A specific subcategory has been eliminated and absorbed into a broader one. This is what makes bureaucratic erasure so effective. It is not the destruction of evidence in a dramatic sense. It is the removal of specificity. The institution remains able to function. The public-facing story remains intact. But the internal map becomes less legible to outsiders and eventually to itself. By 1932, the estate's surviving records begin to look like a house that never needed a backstage at all. The grand sequence remains. The European performance remains. The operational skeleton is present only in generic terms, stripped of the words that would let you connect it to earlier control measures. The silence has matured. It no longer needs active enforcement. It is embedded in what has been allowed to survive. And the evidence of that maturity is not a locked door or a hidden wall. It is a clean gap in a numbered list, a missing photograph in a curated album, a clerk's strike-through that collapses a category into something harder to question. The record does not end with a confession. It ends with an absence that looks administrative, almost innocent, until you notice how precisely it cuts the thread. The 1931 key register closes on a page where the numbering should continue but doesn't, leaving 2 blank spaces where identifiers should be. 2 missing numbers and no explanation, as if the estate wanted the paper to forget what the building still remembers. By 1941, the trail no longer fails because pages are missing. It fails because what survives begins to contradict itself in small technical ways. Exactly the kind of contradiction institutions overlook when they are trying to keep a story clean. That year matters because it sits inside an era of tightened documentation. Wartime conditions forced inventories, repairs, and procurement to become more formal. Materials were tracked, costs were justified, responsibility was assigned. And when responsibility is assigned on paper, inconsistencies become easier to detect, because the bureaucracy has to pretend it is precise. The inconsistency appears in a document that looks routine, a work order packet dated August 22, 1941, filed under House Repairs. It authorizes replacement hardware and reinforcement work in what the paperwork calls East Storage Access. The phrasing is already a clue. Earlier records, 1917, 1918, 1920, treated this area as a controlled passage, then as a renamed utility zone, then as a classified maintenance category. By 1931-1932, the specific references thinned out. In 1941, the area reappears, but under a label that pretends it has always been only storage. The packet includes 3 key elements: a supplier invoice, an internal approval line, and a completion certification signature. Taken individually, none of it looks suspicious. Taken together, it doesn't add up. The first problem is the cost. The supplier invoice is issued by Harrington and Coder Hardware, Miami, and it lists reinforced steel door leaf, custom hinge set, and strike plate assembly, along with labor for fitting. The total is high for ordinary storage access, high enough to suggest a security-grade installation rather than a convenience upgrade. Yet the document's description insists the work is minor and routine, using language reserved for repairs that should not draw attention. The action here is visible on paper. The work is described down as routine while the purchased materials describe it up as serious. That gap is an inconsistency you can't resolve with taste or interpretation. It is a mismatch between what the estate claims it is doing and what it is paying for. The second problem is the date and scope. The work order's internal narrative claims the installation is a response to recent wear and includes a line stating area established 1929. That single phrase is out of alignment with the earlier trail. In 1920, we already see the reclassification on the circulation plan and the vocabulary shift from service to utility and storage. By 1918, a memo had already standardized restrictions. The idea that the area is established 1929 reads like a bureaucratic shortcut, or worse, a constructed reference point designed to reset the timeline. Institutions do this more often than they admit. If a timeline becomes inconvenient, You move the beginning forward. You declare the start of an area as the moment it became officially legible under a new label, not the moment it existed. That is a paperwork strategy. It does not require anyone to lie directly. It requires only that someone choose an origin date that supports the current narrative. The third inconsistency is the signature. The completion certification, normally signed by an engineer or a facilities supervisor, bears the name R.K. Wallace with the title Preservation Engineer. That title is anachronistic in tone for how private estates describe staff in the early period, but by 1941, it could plausibly exist inside an administrative framework preparing for a more institutional future. The problem is not the title itself. The problem is that Wallace's name appears elsewhere in the surviving file set as a procurement officer, not as a technical certifier. In a 1938 purchasing ledger, the initials RKW are attached to vendor negotiations, not to completion approvals. The action that reveals the inconsistency is basic cross-checking, matching the signature against earlier appearances of the same name or initials across different file types. When the same person seems to hold two incompatible roles in the record, you have to consider why. Either the archive, conflated identities, or someone signed where they were not meant to sign. And in controlled environments, signatures are not just formalities. They are authority made visible. None of this proves a conspiracy, and the investigation does not need one. What it suggests is more practical and more common. The institution was trying to close the file in a way that kept the public narrative stable. In 1941, the estate needs to justify a costly reinforcement of a door that, on paper, leads to storage. If the door is truly trivial, the cost looks irresponsible. If the door is actually sensitive, the description cannot admit it. So the paperwork splits the difference. It uses ordinary language, storage, routine, minor, while purchasing extraordinary hardware. It assigns a convenient origin date that moves the story forward. It attaches a signature that seals the transaction even if the chain of role and responsibility is blurred. The consequence is not just administrative embarrassment. It is institutional vulnerability. Once you have a high-cost security installation described as routine, you create a future problem for anyone tasked with explaining the site's integrity. Over time, these mismatches accumulate. They become the cracks through which later investigators can see the shape of deliberate narrative management. Not because the documents confess, but because they fail to maintain internal coherence. Bureaucracy can hide many things, but it struggles to hide its own. Accounting. This is why serious investigations rarely hinge on dramatic revelations. They hinge on errors that occur when people are trying to keep the record clean. If you rewrite labels, you eventually forget which label corresponds to which reality. If you reset timelines, you eventually contradict earlier references. If you centralize control, you eventually generate paperwork that has to justify expenditures without telling the true reason for them. In 1941, the record is no longer simply silent. It is inconsistent, which is often the most valuable form of evidence because it emerges unintentionally. The packet ends with an internal routing slip stamped "Filed Repairs," and attached to it is a small handwritten note in pencil. Do not include on visitor materials. The handwriting is different from the signature. The note is not a policy statement. It is a reminder. It suggests someone still understood that whatever was being reinforced was not meant to be part of the public story. And there, on the invoice line, the contradiction remains in plain sight. A security-grade door paid for like a liability, described like a storage closet. An expensive object made ordinary by language, as if the paper could flatten reality into something safer. By 1950, the risk was no longer confined to whether an awkward detail might circulate in a society column. The risk had become institutional. Vizcaya was moving into an era when historic places were increasingly consumed as public. Culture and public culture runs on trust. Trust in the story, trust in the caretakers, trust that what is shown is representative of what exists. That is why the 1941 packet matters in a different way once you reach 1950. The door reinforcement, the inflated cost framed as routine, the reset origin date, the signature that doesn't cleanly match the role, those are not just clerical flaws. In the wrong hands, at the wrong moment, they become the outline of a narrative that an estate and its partners cannot control once it is in print. The pressure point is simple. Post-war America was reorganizing itself around leisure, mobility, and civic identity. Miami's growth was becoming a national story in its own right, sold through sun, sophistication, and cultural legitimacy. Vizcaya fits that need perfectly, a Europeanized mansion on Biscayne Bay that makes the city look older, richer, more anchored than it actually was. In 1950, that symbolic value is an asset shared by more than the eye. Estate's internal managers. It is shared by local boosters, by cultural networks, and by the emerging ecosystem of donors and patrons who prefer stable narratives to complicated ones. If a reporter can frame Vizcaya not as a masterpiece of design, but as a carefully edited performance with an intentionally obscured operational spine, then every party relying on Vizcaya as proof of refinement inherits the fallout. The first threat would be press framing. The local press could treat it as a curiosity, but the national press could treat it as a pattern, another American fortune that tried to manufacture European legitimacy while suppressing the mechanics underneath. And by 1950, you no longer needed to accuse anyone of crime to cause damage. You only needed to show inconsistency and suggest motive. A single story structured around why was a security-grade door installed in 1941 and described as routine could metastasize into broader questions. What was being secured? Why was the origin date shifted? Who had authority to sign off? And what other records were tidied to keep the narrative clean? The strongest investigative stories are often built on the smallest proven contradiction, because contradictions are easy to quote and hard to dismiss. A second threat would be patron confidence. Institutions and landmark properties, whether formally organized or still quasi-private, depend on relationships with civic leaders, with cultural organizations, with philanthropic circles that see heritage as a public good. In 1950, those relationships are sensitive to scandal, not because scandal changes the building, but because scandal changes the value of association. If donors suspect that a site's public narrative has been strategically curated to hide uncomfortable realities, labor arrangements, class control, private medical concerns, family governance, then donations and partnerships become riskier. The public reason will be polite, budget priorities, focus elsewhere. The private reason will be clear. Nobody wants their name attached to a story that feels manipulative or unstable. The third threat is the tourism economy that historic places increasingly feed. Heritage tourism works when visitors feel they are purchasing access to truth, curated, yes, but not actively evasive. If it becomes common knowledge that operational areas were systematically reclassified, removed from maps, and excluded from descriptions, visitors begin to treat the site as a staged experience rather than a preserved legacy. That shift changes everything. It turns admiration into skepticism. It turns preservation into branding. And once that skepticism appears, it does not stay confined to one corridor. It bleeds into the entire property. The salons become set dressing. The gardens become a postcard. The institution loses the moral authority that makes preservation feel meaningful rather than commercial. The risk also has a class dimension that institutions in 1950 would be especially motivated to avoid. A backstage story inevitably invites a labor story. It reminds the public that Europeanized grandeur in America required staffing, discipline, and controlled movement, often executed by people whose names were not recorded with the same care as imported objects. The 1941 paperwork contradiction is particularly dangerous because it suggests control measures were not incidental. They were invested in. If a security door was expensive, then the reason for security begins to feel important. If the reason feels important, then the obvious next question is, who needed to be kept out? or kept unseen? Once those questions enter print, the estate faces a narrative it cannot counter with architecture. It can only counter it with more language. And language is exactly where the record is most vulnerable. This is why risk management in 1950 would not look like dramatic suppression. It would look like communication discipline. It would look like neutral terms, consistent phrasing, and selective emphasis. The concrete action begins with how the site describes itself. A draft press note from May 1951, the kind of short statement prepared for civic calendars and cultural columns, would not need to mention any corridor or door at all. It would emphasize formal gardens, European art, Biscayne Bay views, architectural heritage, and the Deering legacy. The operational vocabulary would be purged from anything external, and internally, staff. Guidance would tighten. If asked about closed doors, the answer would become standardized, short, and final. Maintenance. Preservation. Not part of the house experience. The goal is not to lie. The goal is to end the conversation before it becomes a story. You can see how the risk is managed by watching what topics are allowed to remain vivid in public materials. In the post-war era, the safest public story is sensory and aesthetic. Rooms, gardens, imported objects, design influence. Those elements invite admiration, but rarely invite scrutiny. A circulation route invites scrutiny because it implies intention, control, and labor. So the estate's public identity becomes increasingly front of house by design. The action here is editorial, the creation of a narrative that makes certain questions feel irrelevant. The consequence is reputational insulation. If the public is trained to think of Vizcaya as gardens and salons, then operational inconsistencies appear to be mere trivia, rather than evidence of governance. The same logic extends to institutional alliances. Cultural networks prefer stable artifacts. Local leaders prefer landmarks that flatter the city. Tourism bodies prefer experiences that feel complete. The risk of scandal is not only that someone discovers an omitted route. The risk is that the omitted route becomes a symbol of institutional manipulation, an emblem of how American prestige was constructed and defended. In 1950, that would be particularly destabilizing because the country was selling itself as modern, confident, legitimate. A story about deliberate omission inside a landmark undermines that confidence. It suggests insecurity. It suggests a need to control what people know. That is the kind of theme journalists can expand with minimal proof, because it resonates with broader social anxieties about status and power. This is where the 1941 inconsistencies become explosive. A mismatched signature is not exciting until it becomes a question of accountability. Who had authority to certify work in a controlled area, and why would their role be blurred? A shifted origin date is not interesting until it becomes a question of intent. Why reset the timeline unless the earlier timeline was inconvenient? An overbuilt door is not meaningful until it becomes a question of purpose. Why pay for security hardware if the area is truly trivial? Each inconsistency is a weak spark alone. Together, in a 1950 media environment, they can form a coherent accusation without anyone needing to prove a hidden room or a sensational secret. The accusation would be simpler. The record was managed to protect the image, and if the record was managed there, it may have been managed elsewhere. So the estate's risk posture in 1950 would naturally become more disciplined. The most effective scandal prevention is not the destruction of documents, it is the creation of a narrative so dominant that the documents feel like footnotes. That means prioritizing what the public sees. Tours become more structured, paths become more definitive, off-route thresholds become less discussable, brochures become more polished and less architectural in their specifics, maps become experiential rather than technical, designed for flow rather than for comprehension. That is a concrete action. The replacement of legible circulation references with curated visitor experiences that do not require showing every connection. And the consequence is exactly What a risk-managed institution wants: plausible deniability through framing. If an investigative question appears about an access point, a door, a record, administrators can respond that the site is preserved, that certain areas are restricted for conservation, and that visitor materials are simplified for safety. Those statements are true in the way institutional statements are often true. They address the surface logic without touching the deeper reason the classification exists. The goal is to keep the issue in the category of operations, because operations do not produce scandals unless someone can prove intent, and intent is hardest to prove when language has been normalized for decades. The risk management also produces a subtle side effect. The more the institution relies on neutral terminology, the more it standardizes silence into routine. Staff learn what not to discuss. Curators learn what not to include. Press materials learn what not to name. Over time, even people inside the organization stop seeing the omission as omission. They begin to see it as how the place is. That is how scandal risk is reduced without any single dramatic act. The institution doesn't need to hide. It needs to habituate. In that sense, by 1950, the silence is not a void. It is a policy instrument. It protects reputations, protects partnerships, protects the tourism value of the site, and protects the city's cultural self-image. And it does so by turning potentially destabilizing specifics into non-specific categories that cannot be easily challenged in public. The most telling artifact from a period like this is often not a report, but a draft, something that shows what was almost said and then removed. Imagine the 1951 press note in its working form, a line that originally reads "service wing," crossed out and replaced by "maintenance areas," the ink still visible beneath the correction. That is the institutional instinct made material, a decision to avoid a term that implies people and movement, and to adopt a term that implies systems and necessity. The paper looks clean when finished, but under the correction, the older truth remains faintly legible, preparing the next phase of the investigation, where silence stops being a response and becomes the default language of the place. By 1976, the silence no longer needs to be defended as a reputational strategy. It has been absorbed into professional practice. The language that once functioned as a discrete shield, utility, storage, maintenance, now arrives wearing the formal authority of preservation policy. That shift is the most important development of the entire chain, because it changes the nature of the omission. In earlier decades, the record looks curated. In the 1970s, the same curatorial impulse is legitimized through standards. The institution does not have to insist that certain doors are not part of the story. It can say they are not part of the tour and let preservation logic do the work. The artifact that captures this change is a thin internal document compiled in September 1976, titled as a Visitor Operations and Preservation Guidelines Packet. It is not dramatic. It reads like modern museum administration: routes, staffing, safety notes, and scripts for guest interaction. The packet is produced by the Preservation Department in coordination with Visitor Services, and it includes a short section labeled Restricted Areas. In that section, the terms appear the way you would expect them to appear in a professional manual, calmly, repetitively, with no explanation beyond necessity. Restricted, preservation, maintenance. The words are not used to hide a scandal. They are used to prevent liability, manage conservation, and control flow. That is what makes them so powerful. Their legitimacy makes them unquestionable. The action that normalizes the silence is simple and procedural. The packet instructs staff to treat any inquiries about closed doors or non-tour circulation as a matter of conservation, and to respond with standardized phrasing. The exact kind of phrase matters less than its function. It ends the conversation without triggering suspicion, not accessible due to preservation concerns. Operational area. Maintenance only. The script does not deny anything. It classifies. Classification is a modern form of closure. It turns curiosity into a category problem rather than a historical one. What makes 1976 different from 1950 is The tone of certainty. Earlier communications avoided specifics because specifics were risky. In the 1976 manual, avoidance is framed as best practice. A closed route is not a narrative decision, it is a preservation decision. A missing connection is not an omission, it is a safety protocol. And once those statements become routine, the institution stops needing to remember why the boundary existed in the first place. The boundary becomes self-justifying because it is anchored in institutional duty. You can see this in how the terminology settles into a stable hierarchy. The old socially loaded phrase service no longer appears. Utility appears only in internal schematics. Maintenance becomes the outward-facing explanation. Preservation becomes the final authority. This is not cosmetic. It is a system designed to ensure that the public receives a single, consistent logic. If a visitor presses, if they ask why a corridor seems to vanish, or why an architectural line feels unfinished, the staff member is trained to move upward in that hierarchy. Maintenance becomes preservation. Preservation becomes policy. And policy is not something a visitor can debate. Policy is how institutions prevent questions from becoming narratives. A second document from 1978 reinforces how routine this has become. An updated tour route map, public version, produced for visitor flow. It is simplified by design. It prioritizes what is visible, safe, and story-friendly. Grand rooms, galleries, gardens, views. Areas that once existed on internal circulation plans appear either as blank zones or as unlabeled blocks. The map does not claim they are absent. It simply makes them uninteresting by giving them no language at all. That is an action of omission executed through design. The consequence is subtle but profound. The public learns what to consider real by what the institution chooses to label. This is how decades pass without conflict. Visitors are trained by experience. If something is not on the map, it becomes mentally erased. If a door is closed and the explanation is preservation, the visitor feels responsible for not asking further. Preservation language carries moral weight. It reframes curiosity as inconvenience. It suggests that insistence is selfish, that questions risk harm, that moral weight is not fake. Preservation does require limits, but the weight can also be used as an instrument to stabilize a curated narrative without ever appearing manipulative. The mechanism is so effective because it does not require active deception. It requires consistent repetition. Every time a staff member uses the same phrase, not part of the tour, they reinforce an invisible boundary in the visitor's mind. Every time a brochure highlights gardens and salons, it confirms what matters. Every time a guide redirects attention away from operational features, it teaches an aesthetic discipline. Look here, not there. Over years, that discipline becomes part of the site's identity. People come to Vizcaya expecting a certain experience, and the institution delivers it. Anything outside that experience is treated as extraneous, not mysterious. The consequence of this normalization is institutional amnesia. By the late 1970s, even internal staff who inherit the manual may not know why a particular corridor was once labeled restricted, or why an access point required reinforced hardware in 1941. They only know the present classification. Restricted for preservation. The older reasons, reputation, narrative control, social optics, fade because they are not needed to enforce the boundary. The boundary enforces itself through policy. This is how silence becomes routine. It stops being a decision and becomes a default setting. And yet, routine leaves its own traces. In the 1976 packet, a maintenance checklist includes a line that seems ordinary until you connect it to the earlier chain. East access, check lock, verify restricted by. Status, log key custody. The wording is procedural, almost sterile, but it preserves continuity. A status that began as restricted in 1917 survives nearly 60 years later as a checkbox item, still requiring custody verification, still requiring documentation, still requiring the institution to acknowledge, quietly, internally, that something there remains sensitive enough to manage. That is the paradox. The public is trained not to ask because the institution teaches that certain doors are not part of history. Internally, the institution continues to treat the same threshold as something that must be maintained as restricted. The silence becomes normal not because the boundary disappears, but because the boundary is stabilized into administrative routine. The door becomes just another line on a checklist. The classification becomes just another policy phrase. The questions vanish because the language is designed to make questioning feel unnecessary. And this is where the investigation advances again. Because once silence is normalized, its strongest evidence is no longer scandal language or missing pages. It is the persistence of restricted status across decades under different justifications. A reputational boundary becomes a preservation boundary. A narrative decision becomes a safety protocol. The institution appears more professional, more legitimate, more trustworthy, while the same controlled access remains in place. The manual ends with a short staff reminder, the kind that reads like nothing until you have followed the chain from 1917 onward. Do not speculate with visitors. It is the most honest sentence in the file. It does not say there is nothing to speculate about. It says the institution understands speculation is possible and it wants it contained. That is what normalization looks like when it is fully matured. An ordinary instruction in a professional packet, carrying the weight of 60 years of managed language. The page closes. On a line typed in all caps, used as a procedural emphasis, restricted areas are not part of the interpretive experience, and beneath it, in the margin, a small handwritten addition, likely from a supervisor training a new guide, adds 2 words, if asked. In 2024, Vizcaya does what it has always done. It delivers a finished impression. The name on the gate is no longer a private estate's quiet signature. It is an institution's public promise. Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. You arrive with the expectation the site itself encourages, European refinement translated into an American setting, an imported sense of permanence on Biscayne Bay. The official tone is confident, practiced, and calm. It tells you what to look at, what to value, and what to remember. The present-day experience is built around a route. You follow it without thinking, because the route feels natural. You are guided toward the grand sequence, the rooms that photograph well, the symmetry that reads as intention, the objects that signal taste, the gardens that justify the entire mythology in one glance. The language in official visitor materials, maps, brief descriptions, interpretive signage, privileges composition over operation. Europe is the headline. Craftsmanship is the reassurance. Preservation is the moral frame. The visitor is invited to admire, not to audit. The action that matters for an investigation is simple. You take the official visitor map seriously as a document, not as a convenience. You trace the public path and compare it to the physical cues that remain in the building. Service thresholds that still exist as architecture even when they are absent as narrative. In the main experience, you are shown doors that open onto curated rooms and doors that do not. The closed doors are not treated as mysterious. They are treated as routine. Their signage, when it exists, is often minimal and categorical. Staff only, restricted, maintenance, sometimes folded into the broader language of preservation. That vocabulary is the inheritance of decades. It functions as an explanation without being an explanation. The museum's public discourse is not dishonest. It is consistent, which is more important. In the present, consistency is the institution's form of integrity. Restricted reads as responsibility. Preservation reads as care. Maintenance reads as necessity. Those words are persuasive because they are true in general. Historic houses do require restricted zones. Objects do require controlled environments. Visitor safety does require limits. The problem, for a documentary investigation, is that the same words can also operate as a screen, precisely because they are true enough that few people demand specificity. In practice, the visitor learns what the institution wants them to learn, that the story lives where the tour lives. The interpretation emphasizes Europe, refinement, gardens, art, and Miami's transformation into a cultural stage. It makes the house feel inevitable, and that is the most effective form of narrative control, because it does not feel like control. It feels like education. You leave knowing what the institution told you was important, and you do not feel deprived, because the experience is complete on its own terms. But the blind spots are not theoretical. They appear as small physical frictions between what is emphasized and what remains visible but unspoken. A door that looks older than its modern label. A corridor. Alignment that implies a connection the public route never uses. A threshold that seems too deliberately placed to be just storage. A section of the plan that becomes vague exactly where you would expect operational circulation to be legible. The museum does not need to deny these things. It only needs to classify them. Classification is the modern version of closure. The investigative contrast becomes sharper when you treat the institution's present-day materials as part of a lineage. The visitor narrative is clean because it has been refined for decades to be clean. It inherits the 1950s risk management logic, avoid operational specificity in public, and the 1970s preservation professionalization logic, translate any operational omission into conservation policy. In 2024, that translation is so complete that most visitors do not recognize it as translation. They accept the premise that what is not part of the tour is not part of the story. That acceptance is not ignorance. It is training. The institution trains it through tone, through design, through maps, through the confident reduction of complex operations into a few neutral categories. The action that exposes the difference between tourism and investigation is almost boring. You read, you compare, you pay attention to what the institution names and what it refuses to name. The public-facing language tends to be rich in aesthetic specificity, Beaux-Arts influence, Mediterranean references, imported artistry, and thin in operational specificity. The moment the subject approaches staff circulation or controlled access, the language becomes general. It stops using nouns that imply people, service, staff, household, and relies on nouns that imply systems, utility, maintenance, preservation. That shift is not accidental. It is a tested method for keeping curiosity from acquiring traction. What does this mean in the present? It means the case is functionally resolved for the visitor economy. The institution provides a coherent experience, and coherence is what the public pays for. The legacy appears intact. The myth is supported by beautiful evidence. The visible rooms are preserved. The gardens are maintained. The story is satisfying. In that sense, the institution succeeds. It does exactly what a heritage site is expected to do in 2024: protect, interpret, and provide access to meaning. But documentary investigation requires a different standard. It is not satisfied by coherence. It looks for continuity between physical reality and documentary reality. And the chain we have followed: 1917 restriction language, 1918 administrative posture, 1920 paper reclassification, 1931 archival thinning, 1941 bureaucratic mismatch, 1950 reputational risk logic, 1976 normalization through preservation, creates a specific kind of present-day tension. The tension is not that the institution is hiding a melodramatic secret. The tension is that the institution has inherited a method, a way of managing what the public believes exists by managing what the public is taught to name. In the present, that method is visible in the most ordinary moments. A guide smoothly redirects attention away from a closed threshold without drama. A sign gives a categorical reason rather than a historical one. A map uses blank space where operational continuity would complicate the experience. An official description foregrounds the imported European performance while treating the supporting machinery as irrelevant. These are normal museum choices, but when you place them against the surviving hints in older records, they stop feeling like mere operational choices. They begin to look like continuity. The consequence is not an accusation, it is an analytical gap. There is a difference between preserving a place and editing its memory. Preservation is often presented as neutral stewardship, but stewardship always selects. It selects what can be maintained, what can be interpreted, what can be shown, and what will be filed under technical until it becomes culturally invisible. That selection can be justified. It can be necessary. It can also carry forward older motives without anyone consciously intending to do so. That is how institutional legacies work. They do not always pass down secrets. They pass down procedures. So in 2024, the question is no longer, what is behind the door? The question is, why is the door still described as if it is not part of history? If the site's public mission is interpretation, why are certain structural continuities treated as operational clutter rather than interpretive evidence? And if the vocabulary of restriction is now standardized as preservation, what earlier pressures did preservation language absorb and neutralize? This is where the present becomes more than a backdrop. The present is the proof of durability. A boundary created to protect image in the early 20th century can survive into a museum era because it has been re-legitimized by newer, more respectable frameworks. Reputation becomes visitor experience. Control becomes safety. Silence becomes preservation. The public does not experience those translations as evasions. It experiences them as professionalism. That is why the legacy feels intact. The institution has succeeded at making the boundary feel morally correct. And yet, the investigation cannot ignore what has remained consistent. The persistence of restricted status across more than a century of changing justifications. The building still contains operational logic that does not fully appear in public narrative. The paperwork we traced shows repeated efforts to reduce traceability through renaming, reclassification, omission, and finally, normalization. In the present, the outcome is stable. Visitors accept the curated map as the house, and the house continues to contain the parts the map does not reward them for noticing. The closing question, then, stands without needing an answer yet. If Vizcaya was designed to impress a nation, what had to be kept out of the nation's sight for that impression to remain effortless? Not a crime, necessarily. Not a melodrama. Something more structural. The visible proof that prestige is manufactured, managed through corridors, keys, language, and the discipline of what an institution allows to be called history. And the most contemporary evidence is almost painfully ordinary. At the end of the visit, you fold the official map back into your pocket. It is clean, simplified, confident. One section is rendered as a neutral block. No label, no route line, no invitation to wonder. In the building, the corresponding threshold still exists. The door is still there. The modern sign still uses the same vocabulary the institution has relied on for decades. Restricted, preservation, maintenance, and that is where the record even now still begins. In 1916, James Deering did not merely raise a mansion on Biscayne Bay. He raised a proposition that Europe could be imported, staged, and made to feel inevitable in a young American city hungry for legitimacy. Stone, stucco, gardens, and gilded interiors carried the visible argument. But what endured even longer than the marble was the invisible discipline that made the marble believable. The roots that were never meant for admiration, the doors that were never meant for questions, the vocabulary that trained the public to accept absence as order. Now, in 2025, Vizcaya stands as a preserved icon, careful in its presentation, confident in its official story. Yet the investigation we followed did not rely on theories. It relied on administrative mechanics. A restriction logged where the tour pretends there is nothing to restrict. A corridor reclassified until it becomes unsearchable. A plan simplified until the simplified version becomes the real one. An inconsistency in cost and signature that reads like a small bureaucratic failure, until it reveals how hard the record worked to remain coherent. This is how elite history often survives, not as confession, but as procedure. In houses like this, luxury is only one layer. The second layer is governance, the patient management of what cannot be allowed to become narrative. When an institution repeats maintenance, preservation, restricted, it may be speaking truthfully, but it is also inheriting a method older than the museum label itself, the method of turning inconvenient realities into technical categories so they can be maintained without being interpreted. A grand estate does not only preserve rooms, it preserves a hierarchy of visibility. It teaches visitors what to admire, and it teaches them, politely, professionally, what not to name. And so the legacy remains intact, not because every question has been answered, but because unanswered questions have been given respectable places to die. A door becomes a policy, a corridor becomes a blank on a map, a missing number becomes consolidation. A costly reinforcement becomes routine. The public leaves with a complete impression, and the archive, what still survives of it, keeps the incomplete accounting in quiet folders that were never designed to be read as history. If one detail in this investigation held your attention, the word that replaced a more honest label, the gap in a register, the routine cost that wasn't routine, the closed threshold that still shapes the building, leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury, and if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Subscribe so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens, because beyond the gardens and the salons, there are always corridors that were designed to be remembered by the building and forgotten by the record. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.